and thanks for tuning in to this important conversation today, Bridging the Generational Divide, Integrating Gen Z Talent into the Future Workplace. Our objective is to navigate perceptions and realities to unlock Gen Z's potential in the workplace through actionable strategies for integration and mutual success. My name's Jeff Nelder, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a host of Job Ready, the EFA podcast, as well as EFA's Chief Purpose Officer, where we're on a mission to reduce U.S. student debt by helping employers invest in talent they wish to hire and retain. I'm so proud to be joined by a group of truly brilliant leaders with singular perspective, whom I respect so much. Honestly, if I was riding to the North Pole at Christmas time, this is my wish list for who I'd love to have in this conversation. Lisa Lawson is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Since taking the helm in 2019, Lawson has launched several initiatives to maximize Casey's impact, including Thrive by 25, a groundbreaking effort aligning the foundation's work in child welfare and juvenile justice reform, economic opportunity, and community development to improve outcomes for Gen Z. Sarah Reddington serves as Chief Philanthropy Officer for the Miles Foundation, where she spearheads strategic initiatives that amplify community impact, including their Best Place for Working Parents initiative and research, with unique insight into Gen Z as working parents. Huy Nguyen is the Chief of Education and Career Development at Intelligent.com, among other things, where he leads initiatives connecting education to career outcomes. Huy's insights on Gen Z workforce trends have been featured in Forbes, NPR, Business Insider, Fortune, Fast Company, Inside Higher Ed, and many others. And Max Shore is CEO and Chairman of Good Worldwide Inc., the home of Good.is and Upworthy.com, the largest social media megaphone for progress. Max holds singular perspective on Gen Z as this mission-driven media company reaches over 200 million people per month. We're here today because by 2030, Gen Z is projected to make up 30% of the U.S. workforce. Gen Z is already a significant portion of the labor force, occupying 18% of the U.S. workforce in the second quarter of 2024, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. This translates in the U.S. to nearly 35 million Gen Z members of the workforce, set to nearly double in the next 5 years. But at the same time, they're facing unprecedented headwinds from massive change and have grown up during one of the most volatile times in post-millennium U.S. history, sparking backlash from employers due to negative perceptions. This division threatens all of us. Gen Z's developmental years were shaped by the pandemic. They're digital natives. They think extremely innovatively and obviously will play a vital role in the future workforce, especially with an impending age cliff, where everyone in the baby boomer generation will be 65 or older by 2030. We must bridge this generational gap for the sake of our collective future. Today's roundtable will be separated into two segments. Now, in the first segment, we're going to focus on examining employer perceptions versus the actual strengths and capabilities that Gen Z brings to the workplace. Huy, let's start with you. Your research at Intelligent.com has highlighted some concerning employer perceptions about Gen Z. Can you walk us through the key findings and help us understand what's driving these negative perceptions? Like, are they based on actual performance issues or generational misunderstandings?
I think that one of the biggest things that we're seeing out here, and I think regardless of what side of the table that you're sitting on, we're reading all of these different headlines, right? Gen Z lacks work ethic. Gen Z is not ready for the workplace. Employers are no longer hiring entry-level workers as they exit as they graduate from college. And I think it's important to take a step back before I actually provide some information about the research that we've done. But if you can remember back about 10 years ago, or if you actually just go into Google and you type in replace Gen Z with millennial, and you type in, are millennials lazy? Are millennials ready for the workforce? You'll see that those almost are the exact same headlines that we were talking about the previous generation. So I think it's important that some of that perspective is generational, but there's a lot of nuances with Gen Z that make them unique. And they are entering the workforce, as you had mentioned before, where a lot of the baby boomers are also exiting. So now they outnumber that. So at Intelligent, what we do is we regularly survey about 1,000 business owners and hiring managers and business professionals every month, and we gather kind of like what's the pulse in the workforce, what's going on, what's the perception, have things changed, have some of the trends that we're seeing in the headlines, are they validated? One of the common trends that we're seeing is that hiring managers are making a difficult decision right now about, will they continue to hire entry level people? Are they continually hiring them at the same rate that they were before? And a lot of the perception is that college is not preparing Gen Z, to transfer into work ready, members of society. And a lot of that has to do with some of the nuances of COVID, of how they grew up, how they have been in structured environments for the past, 16 years of their life as they went through that entire educational journey, and going into an unstructured workplace where sometimes they're not physically even in the office. What happens is now they're expected to go from a structured environment into an unstructured environment and work autonomously. And so I think that a lot of those perceptions that are out there, some of them are definitely, grounded because of the circumstance, but a lot of the other ones is really just the nuances of this generation.
So there is a divide, there is a gap that we need to address. And, the next place that I would look in order to address that gap is really towards the strengths, that we can use to build a bridge for Gen Z. And that's really where I'd like to come over to you, Lisa. From your foundation's perspective, working with diverse communities, what unique strengths and perspectives does Gen Z bring that employers might be overlooking? And, really, how has their experience growing up during the pandemic actually prepared them for today's workplace challenges, if you think it has?
Well, Jeff, I think you did a great job of describing the unique childhood and adolescence that Gen Z has had, different than many previous generations with technological disruption, with the pandemic, and the consequence of some of that has also been mental health challenges as well, that they've had to navigate. But the thing we see overwhelmingly is that though they have faced many challenges different than prior generations, they are a resilient and resourceful and ready generation. I love that you asked about their strengths. One of the things that disappoints me most as a person who leads in the nonprofit sector around children and youth issues is the negative perceptions that people have of young people and the way that they enter conversations about them. But I want to speak up on behalf of the thousands of young people that I have met and just share some of the strengths I see in them and the resilience I see in them. First of all, they want to work. I don't think there could be any worse misrepresentation of this generation than that they don't want to work. One simple example is that we work with lots of summer youth programs in cities around the country, and in not one city is the city able to meet the demand of young people who want to work. I think that's just one example that young people they know they need to get on a path to the future and see their summer jobs programs in their cities as a great entree to do that. But we as, communities are not stepping up to meet that demand. So we should first know that they really want to work. Second, they are hungry to learn by doing. These young people are experiential. They want to be able to connect the learning that they might have had in school with the real world opportunities they know that exist. It helps make school more relevant for them, but it also enables them to really make sure they've got the perspective and the skill sets they're going to need to be successful in the workplace. And so they really like to learn by doing. One of the bridges that we've seen be really successful is youth apprenticeship programs. They're opportunities for young people who are in high school or college to begin getting post-secondary credits and credentials that are going to serve them long term. It helps them get work experience and to build mentors and relationships in the workplace that help them. And so those kinds of bridges are ways that young people can get that kind of practical workplace experience that they need. And then Third, I'll say they crave mentors. We know this is a generation that's grown up having to navigate the pandemic and kept them away not just from their peers, but from adults who could help them understand how to navigate the world. I agree that some of what people think about young workers is misunderstanding who they are and what they've been through, but they really want mentors who can help them know, what am I supposed to wear to work? How do I handle a question I have? How do I open myself to let my boss know I don't quite understand this assignment? And mentors are really critical to that. And then finally, I'll say young people are very entrepreneurial. When I talk to them, lots of them want to be entrepreneurs, but are very open to being entrepreneurs. And so I think helping them learn how to channel their creativity and energy in ways that can really benefit their employers will be helpful. So I hope that offers some different perspective on the strengths that young people bring to the workplace.
Absolutely. As somebody who has put together teams, I mean, what we're looking for more than ever before because of the onset of AI is people who have a desire to work, people who are open to receiving feedback, and people who are comfortable with ambiguity. And that's the entrepreneurial core strength, right? Is having a comfort with that core strength in any time of change. So thank you for that, Lisa. And speaking of strengths, Max, as someone leading two purpose-driven brands with a unique view into Gen Z through both good and Upworthy, what have you noticed about how to understand Gen Z's values and expectations as assets rather than obstacles? So what can established companies learn about Gen Z, the workplace culture and social responsibility, to help prepare the workplace for Gen Z?
Yeah, appreciate that, Jeff, and great to be on this discussion with all of you. Really admire the work that you do. And yeah, I think it's an incredible asset thinking about how much Gen Z cares and how much they pay attention. And this is a generation that's, been bombarded with issues their whole lives, and they're very attuned to it. And I think they also have pretty good bullshit meter for authenticity. And so it can be a hard thing for big institutions that aren't always the most authentic or values aligned to be really resonant with this generation. But it's so important for organizations to get that right, because I think when you can dial in a sense of that intrinsic motivation for this generation, there's just so much capacity and capability. I loved what Lisa was talking about in terms of the resilience and how much eagerness there is to get to work. And so I see it as a huge opportunity. I do think clarity is really important. I think there's so much space for misunderstanding. I think we can get further into that, into the as we discuss further. But being really clear about expectations, being really fair to people, and really having empathy for this generation about what they've been through and how do we try to set them up for success. But I think when we do that, and I'm really fortunate, to have these purpose-oriented brands. Gen Z is really motivated, but the onboarding is something that's just so important, of just making that connection, building that trust, and really making sure that you tap into that intrinsic motivation of the person.
Wow, Max. Thank you for that. And that's the perfect intro to Sarah. We talked about so many things that are Gen Z related before we ever recorded today. And in your philanthropy work, you've assessed education initiatives with a workplace outcome. And you've likely seen successful Gen Z integration initiatives. So I'd love it if you could share examples of organizations that have effectively harnessed Gen Z talent, and just tell us what made these efforts successful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, for having us. I'm taking notes and have already learned so much in the first couple of minutes. So pleased to be here. At the Miles Foundation, we've gathered data and education from cradle to career to really see what makes young children and then students and then adults successful in the course of their learning and life trajectory. And what we know, to underscore what Max and everyone's shared thus far, is that Gen Z in particular is looking for meaningful work that aligns with their personal values. 54% of Gen Zs are considering meaning in their work as they evaluate employers, meaning does this deepen sort of purpose in their life. But tied very closely to meaning on their priority list is well-being. And this is another key component to the happiness equation for Gen Z in the workplace. And well-being encompasses mental health, it encompasses personal and professional healthy relationships, and work-life balance. And what we know through our research in our national initiative called the Best Place for Working Parents is that there are some employer policies that have research to prove they're not just boosting employee well-being, but they also help businesses' bottom line. So two of those policies that I'll mention today are remote work and paid time off. So for example, those employers that were offering exemplary paid time off policies, which includes at least 18 paid holidays and at least 20 PTO days, had employees with 16 times higher personal relationship satisfaction scores than their peers. And for the company itself, they also get a benefit of increased productivity and reduced turnover, which actually equates to $12 per employee per week, when PTO actually costs, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates about $7 per employee per week. So PTO in this case really pays for itself. And for those offering remote work, our research showed employees had double better health outcomes, so twice better health outcomes and double the personal relationship satisfaction scores. And as I mentioned, what we've done with Best Place for Working Parents is ensure that all of these policies really have a direct ROI to business. So for example, those employers that offer remote work also have employees that are twice as motivated than those in competitive companies. And that makes a measurable difference to productivity and the bottom line, right? When you boil down policies that are good for Gen Z and millennials, you mentioned a Gen Z stat at the beginning, Jeff. Gen Z and millennials together are projected to make up 74% of the worldwide workforce by 2030. So these aren't just policies that are good for employees to show it as their best and most productive selves, but they're really sustainable, smart, and profitable business policies for our employer community as well.
You know, listening to all of you and your perspective, I know you are very transparent and very clear in what you communicate, but still there's this disconnect. And, you know, I want to just take a moment to address the elephant in the room, this narrative around Gen Z's work ethic and reliability. You know, I'd love this to be a lightning round around, you know, what role perhaps does communication style and expectation setting play in these perceptions? You know, and thinking about generational bias versus legitimate workplace readiness concerns. It comes up all the time in conversations that I have. What are your thoughts? I mean, I want to go around the room. Max, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it. I love what you were saying, Sarah, is kind of popping my brain a little bit about just health and well-being. The meaning is a big one, but the well-being. I was at a conference recently where somebody from the Compassion Institute actually was talking about the role of a good manager making well-being a deliverable. So they're all the things that are, but like your own well-being should be a deliverable. Now, I think some of the generation that's in charge right now didn't have that as a luxury when they were coming in. And so I think it's easy to say like, hey, I had to trial by fire, so this generation needs to as well. And I can see the disconnect when this generation is less willing to do that. But I think taking approaches like what you referenced, Sarah, is really powerful. I want to make sure I get the question just right, Jeff, because I was still just kind of like, you know, digesting this health as a well-being. The question is really around how real is this gap?
How legitimate is this gap? You know, I mean, Gen Z likes to work, entrepreneurial, innovative, has grown up as a digital native.
Yeah.
And yet there's still this gap. There's still this headwind that they're facing. And when I see that type of a headwind, I think, well, communication style, expectation setting, those feel, but that's me. I want to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think this coincides so much with the remote work. I think you've got smartphones and you've got remote work, and you've got a society where trust is going by the wayside and fear is going up. And so in that situation, if something's going wrong, it's easier to blame somebody else than to take responsibility. And I think it's very easy to say, gosh, I can't see them. You know, where are they? And so I can understand how some of this disconnect exists. Now, I think it's really important that companies learn how to unleash Gen Z. And so we are fortunate. We have an office. We have a couple offices, but we do have a primarily remote, flexible dynamic. I think one of the biggest challenges is onboarding people. So we just onboarded a Gen Z person, you know, a couple months ago. And that team had a gathering all together. And so people are in person. I think that's a really important part of the onboarding. It costs money to do things like that. And then we have an all company gathering where everyone's together. And I will say we are making some of the gatherings more about bonding and having good, enjoyable experiences than getting every minute into highly effective, productive work, because we feel like we can work together once we know each other and we're bonded. We do have productive work sessions when we're together, but change is hard. And so I think organizations need to evolve and to really fully tap into Gen Z. And so I can understand where some of these misperceptions, but I'm really excited about Gen Z. And I think the key is that we're small enough that we can be really intentional when we onboard Gen Z. And I think we're seeing Gen Z add a ton of value to our organization. So that's my perspective.
That's a fabulous perspective, Max. Thank you. And Lisa, I want to come over to you. I know you, as a manager, you have deep, broad experience, but then also in the work that you do, you observe other management structures and their experience. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think that much of what we've talked about in terms of different expectations about what work will be like, different communication styles certainly play into the differences. But what we found works is that there is change that is required across the generations. So we provide tools and resources to employers to help them think about things that Max said. How do you onboard? How do you create a buddy system for newer employees? How do you understand what they're expecting to get out of this? How do you help them understand how to communicate their ideas? All of that needs to be partnered with work on a younger employee's part of understanding the work culture and expectations in a work culture about how you respond to things in a timely way, etc. I'll share that in our organization, we work across all the generations. So we serve Gen Alpha and Gen Z. Our employees are millennials. The decision makers we have to influence are boomers. And so we had an intergenerational all-staff meeting last year where we focused on what are the differences across the generations and how can we highlight the assets each has and learn from the wisdom of each other. And it was really a breakthrough, I think. So I think my contribution to this is really that it requires all generations to think about how to work with one another. It's about, I call it intergenerational agility. It's not just about how do we get Gen Z to be better or different, but how do we all learn how to have a respectful workplace where everyone can bring their best attributes to the conversation?
We've got to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And I always come back to empathy as a strength because of that. Sarah, I saw you agreeing vehemently, but I know that your perspective is unique. And, if you were to think about, why does this gap still exist? What's going on? What's the contribution? What's your quick thought?
Well, I think I loved intergenerational agility. I totally agree, Lisa. We all have adaptations to make because the world is quickly changing, right, for all of us. And I guess my perspective here for this question is, I think it's hard to make categorical assumptions based on generations. I realize that's what we're doing on today's conversation, but to that end, it's really about the individual, right? It really does boil down to the individual. It depends on how that individual's family life was, what were their educational and training opportunities, what were those outside factors that really impacted them. And so for the Miles Foundation, that's really why we take a whole child, whole community approach to our work and education, because education doesn't just happen in the classroom. That's one component of many that factors into whether a child or employee is workforce ready.
And speaking of workforce ready, all of the research that you've done, the employers that you've interacted with, the results that you've observed, and my own knowledge of you as a believer in an evangelist for Gen Z, what are your thoughts to wrap up this segment?
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with everything that everybody said here, and it's very interesting is because we do single out Gen Z because they're dominating the headlines right now, and we, I feel it's unfair for us to pick on them. In reality, I think beyond Gen Z, we're facing a lot of change within the workforce with AI, technology, and disruption. So while Gen Z is facing this as they're entering the workforce, people that are in the middle of their careers are also facing this as they try to adapt. Right. And so I do think that if we can fix this communication gap or barrier between let's just take the generational tag away, but it's about respect, right? The changing workforce. We used to talk a lot about business modernization or digital transformation. So if you can remember, 10 years ago when the things that you're doing are completely different than what you're doing now and how we communicate, right? We used to call people, we used to email people, but now we've got other tools like Slack and things like that. And I think, Jeff, you and I know that email is not my best communication tool, right? So I almost feel Gen Z myself, if that's how we had to label it. But I think that the most important thing is let's have a look at how the workforce is modernizing and adapting to technology and change. And let's not force Gen Z to come in and adopt outdated workplace norms. I think that's the most important, is that Gen Z has a significant amount of strength and skills that can actually help to modernize the workplace as long as we give them permission. And they need guidance. And so I had a conversation yesterday with a executive leader from a Fortune 100 company, and we were talking about this exact thing. And I was saying that, there's a lot of people that are coming into the workplace right now. They're so highly skilled and they're just so hungry and they want to go, right? And what happens is it really kind of depends on, who's managing them. If they're managed by one person that comes in there, and I use that title as manager because that's officially their title. But if all we're doing is actually managing Gen Z in order to be successful in their job, then I don't think that we're doing a good job. I liked what Lisa said earlier about we need to become mentors. We need to become coaches. And that is probably the most effective thing that I can see. Your manager doesn't actually have to be your coach. Coaches can be all around the organization that can actually help you, right? How do we succeed in this organization? How do we succeed in these types of job roles? And I think that that's the thing, is that, it's no longer a linear path from going to college and working up the corporate ladder. But now it's those people that you meet along the way that show a mutual respect. There's a lot of people that, are exiting the workforce, have a tremendous amount of experience and context that do want to help Gen Z. But we don't have anything, there's not a lot of things that are set up. Sometimes people don't have formal ways in order to find mentors. Sometimes, you need peer mentors. Sometimes you need mentors in other areas. But I think that we need to change from trying to manage Gen Z in order to try to enable them through proper coaching and recognize and give them permission that they actually have the skills that can transform an organization.
Beautiful, Hui. And thank you for making the transition for us and talking about the open doors. And I think you've all talked about open doors, whether it's intergenerational agility or the tenets of empathy and bonding, or simply like you were saying, Hui, we can't work to impugn the strengths of a generation just to make them fit like a square peg in a round hole. We're doing ourselves a disservice, not just the generation. So with this, we've reached the second of our two segments where we're going to focus on practical, actionable strategies for creating workplaces where Gen Z can thrive while meeting organizational needs. So I'd like to come back to you, Lisa, and ask you what specific changes in management approach and workplace structure are most critical in your perspective for successfully integrating Gen Z talent. I'd love you to talk about how organizations can adapt their leadership styles without compromising their standards.
Of course, I'd be happy to talk about it. And I think the ideas I'll share are pretty simple and easy to implement. We've all talked about coaching and mentoring, making sure that young people have those who have walked the path before them to talk to for advice is extraordinarily important. In our work, we call it a positive youth development. How do you create relationships that enable young people to grow and to thrive? And that's just as important in a boys and girls club as it is in the workplace, to make sure that there are those they can ask questions to. I think second, offering work-based learning opportunities. The more we bridge from school to work, the more young people are going to show up ready. So whether it's making sure you have internships, apprenticeships, all of those opportunities for young people to get some early work experience is really important. And that's going to help ease their transition when they become full-time employees, because they will have already gained some of those soft skills, already started learning how to show up in the workplace. So employers ought to make more space for those early learning opportunities. And every time we talk to employers who've done this, they talk about how surprised they are at how creative, how diligent, how open those young people are in the workplace. So being more open to that. I would say providing supportive services. Sarah, it was great to hear you talk about how important wellness is to young people. Employers need to make sure their suite of benefits takes into account things that younger workers are going to be grappling with. Issues like transportation or childcare, which can really make it difficult for younger workers who are paid less, have less financial flexibility to navigate the emergencies that come up in their lives. If employers are willing to just bridge that gap a little bit for them, it can reduce lots of stress that younger workers have trying to show up every day if they aren't sure how they're going to fit in a doctor or a dental appointment, or make sure their children are cared for, or even having to navigate, unreliable bus systems, helping them make sure they have a way to get to work reliably. And then finally, just fostering inclusive work environments. Any place that is, speaking negatively about, a customer who might be Gen Z, imagine how your Gen Z employee might think you feel about them. So making sure your workplace is respectful and welcoming to everyone. And then the last thing I'll say is create opportunities for peer support. We've recently created groups where employees of different levels have an affinity group of sorts where they can exchange best practices with one another. They really enjoy that opportunity to hear what someone who might just be 6 months or a year ahead of them in the workplace is learning. So I think none of these things are going to be terribly expensive for employers but they can make a huge difference in a young person's experience and make them feel cared for. They will feel like their workplace is just being intentional about their integration. So I'd encourage employers to just think creatively about what they can do to build bridges, create an inclusive environment, and really create opportunities for connection both across and upward in their organization.
Thank you, Lisa. And that's a fabulous blueprint. And I realize you, Sarah, have been collecting a lot of unique insights via that 3-minute survey of employers at the Miles Foundation that powers insights for the Best Place for Working Parents initiative. You had shared with me that 1 in 10 Gen Z individuals in the U.S. are parents, with Gen Z making up 1/3 of parents with children under age 2. Now, this is something that nobody thinks about. They don't think of Gen Z as the working parent. They think of Gen Z as the carefree kid, right? So Gen Z isn't typically thought of in this way, but many are. So from a strategic perspective, from the data you've been collecting, how can organizations work with Gen Z as parents to redesign their benefits and career development programs and to align with Gen Z's learning preferences and career expectations?
Yes, we know that working parents have unique needs, and with caregivers making up 75% of today's workforce, it's really important for employers to get these policies right, so that they can attract and retain today's top talent. And as we've all said on this call, today's workplace looks vastly different than it did 20 or even 10 years ago. Today, we only have 27% of fathers who are the sole breadwinner. So you have a vast majority of fully working parent households. And that really changes the game for how men and women are showing up to work, how they're juggling work-life balance, and how they're navigating childcare challenges from birth all the way through high school. And so it's really not surprising in our research that we see that businesses are losing $23 billion a year in productivity costs due to childcare challenges that their workforce is facing. So this isn't just about Gen Z. It's not just about working moms or even families. It really has business and economic consequences for our communities and our country as a whole. We built Best Place for Working Parents back in 2019, hand in hand with our Fort Worth business community. And it was really as a multi-pronged solution to help employers implement research-backed policies that would help them attract and retain today's top talent, while also helping to boost and expand those policies that we know are helping caregivers, families, and working parents thrive. So 2 things I think we've learned through Best Place for Working Parents that is particularly relevant to Gen Z that I'll share today. 1, we always recommend by starting with surveying your workplace, your workforce. Every workforce and employee group is unique with unique challenges. They're at different life stages. And so trying to put together a suite of policies without garnering employee input can really, we've seen that can waste time, money, or both for employers. So we strongly suggest starting by surveying employees, and particularly for Gen Z, they want to be heard and they want their input to make an impact in their workforce. They want to see that feedback loop. And so the act of surveying your employees can actually go a long way in building goodwill. My employer cares about my input and my feedback and wants to make improvements based on my experience and needs. That's a powerful culture to set. Secondly, flexibility continues to rate at the top of the policies that are working for businesses that are employing working parents. So 96% of our 1,500 designated best place for working parents businesses across the country offer some type of flexibility. And our research again shows that those businesses offering flexibility have employees that rate their workplace as 125 times more supportive as a workplace than those peers that don't offer flexibility. So this is an incredibly powerful policy, to your point, Lisa, with a very low cost for offering that. But there are lots of employers that can't provide flexibility, and we recognize that when they can't. If they're manufacturing or retail or many other industries, they need people at the front lines showing up every day. And what we've seen successful there is when employers can offer predictability, and particularly in some form of technology advances that really harnesses the gig culture mentality that Gen Z really is leaning into, while also putting technology to the forefront as a potential solution, particularly in communication space, which is where Gen Z can feel more comfortable. One example, one of our manufacturing companies in Tennessee, Enco, has 5,000 of their 7,000 employees are shift workers. And they adopted a shift swap, which is an app where you can, in real time, post a shift live. If I can't make my shift this morning, I can post it. Someone else can take it. And that actually eases the predictability, flexibility, and communications between, not just for employees, but for those managers as well. So that's just one example of how our business community and Best Place for Working Parents are doing really great things to innovate, to capitalize on the skills and desires of the younger generation. But we certainly encourage employers that are looking to explore new policies to take our Best Place for Working Parents self-assessment. It's free. It takes 3 minutes, and it's a great starting place to get some ideas for where to be impactful.
I love that, and I highly recommend anybody listening does that. Max, I saw you nodding about that, and I bet you're going to dig into it. But let's go to you. Gen Z values purpose and social impact. So how can organizations authentically integrate these elements into their value proposition without appearing performative, without appearing like they're just inauthentic in some way? What practical steps do you think companies can take?
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff. And it's hard for me not to dig in on the working parent thing because I've got 2 young daughters right now, but so appreciate the work you're doing on that, Sarah, and eager to take the assessment. But yeah, I think the framing that I love is that Gen Z is helping us evolve to be a better workplace and to be better organizations. And, when you think of, you can easily have a framing where you're like, oh my gosh, they need this or they need that. But when you think about the things that they need, like a fair culture, clarity, well-being as a deliverable, or health or flexibility, these are things that all people want. And then when you think of their strengths, I think, the creativity, the purpose, the authenticity, these are things that our organizations need to modernize and get better. I loved what you were saying, Hui, about the technological innovation and modernizing our organization, how they can be drivers for that as well. But so I just think of all of their attributes, those attributes, as a real blessing that we can be a better organization. And I'm trying to look internally of where am I letting down Gen Z? Because actually by being clearer, by being more fair, and by having a more tangible, realizable purpose, it's not just, I'm creating a better on-ramp for Gen Z, I'm creating a more successful company. And our full belief is that organizations that have a clear, authentic purpose grow better and grow faster. And so I think every organization needs that, not just to be able to succeed with Gen Z, but to succeed in the modern workforce. But really appreciate the question, Jeff.
So Max, I know that you've had this orientation about doing well by doing good and giving a damn, right? As a fundamental way to go through life. Is Gen Z's orientation versus these intergenerational orientations in any way misaligned? Are their expectations higher for purpose? Can it be the same level of, I know whether it's good core or any of the other innovative work that the good team has done, you've always tried to infuse purpose and tried to incentivize and demonstrate how to infuse purpose. Are all things equal, or Or does Gen Z have a higher level of expectation, and how would an organization meet that?
I can't, to Sarah's point, but I can't speak for all of Gen Z. I mean, the individuals that we brought on who are Gen Z have been phenomenal. I will say there can be a tendency sometimes. I think the authenticity is a real plus, but there can be a sense that everybody has my point of view. And I think that we're learning how to navigate that, of encouraging that authenticity, but also encouraging, what we're using as a lens is curiosity, of how do we use curiosity as a way to bridge divides and perspectives. And I feel like they're gung-ho about that, but without that lens, sometimes I think there can be missing of perspectives. And so we're trying to bring some of that curiosity in. But yeah, I mean, it does feel like it would be hard. You can dial up the compensation and dial up the perks and the flexibility, and yeah, maybe they'll stay there. And I can't speak for all of Gen Z, but I do think having a workplace where they believe in the work and they believe in the purpose helps. We've had very, very low attrition. And a really motivated workforce. And I think it really is a reflection of authentic purpose, and eager to continue onboarding Gen Z. But there are things like that where, okay, the authenticity is great, but how do we bring curiosity for differing viewpoints? Or, there's a real love for flexibility. How do we make sure that we bust through some of the discomforts of being in person and having direct conversations? And I think the real big one is it's very easy, for anyone, I think, to avoid discomfort, right? And clarity is the kindness here, though. Like, you really have to figure out, how are you really clear about expectations, even if it's going to make some of these, rising workers uncomfortable for the moment. How do you do it? But one of the framings I really liked, there's this great book called Finding Clarity by Mark Lesser, and he has this framing of compassionate accountability. And I like that. I think some of the older generations think of accountability in a way that's very harsh. And I do think this idea of clarity as kindness, or really bringing empathy into the framework of accountability, of like, we want these young people to succeed. How do we set up a system so that they can? As a working parent, I think that's super important for other working parents. But with Gen Z having gone through everything, I think it's really important. And I think the exciting thing is that, I just think that lens of, we'll be better off when we create a workforce where Gen Z will succeed in it.
All boats rise. All boats rise. Curiosity as a bridge. I love it, Max. And taking what Max just said and your focus on technology and communication, right? They're often cited as areas where Gen Z excels, but also where these conflicts arise. In your perspective, how can organizations leverage Gen Z's digital nativity, right, while establishing the appropriate workplace communications norms? Things like what Max was talking about, but you've observed these across organizations and industries. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's about just listening as well, right? And I think that we understand that, I think organizations oftentimes they have certain goals in mind of, we do things a certain way because we want to be more productive, and we have to have systems in place in order to do these. But as I mentioned before, sometimes as the businesses modernize, these systems become outdated. And then, if you can think about where we all used to consume content, all of that stuff has changed, right? And so these early adopters, I won't just necessarily talk about Gen Z again, but they're more digitally native. They grew up with mobile devices in their phone, their hand. They don't need a manual to go and figure out how to install a new program or do new things. And so I think that that's what they're used to. That's what they're accustomed to, is like adopting new technology. So I think that it's important to involve everybody into that conversation, is that, as the workplace modernizes, are we doing the things that are most effective for our organization versus the things that we're supposed to be doing because these are the, like best in breed software or workplace standard operating procedures? Is that the best thing to do? Now, I think that it's about, like, sometimes on Gen Z's side as well, is that they need to respect that there are certain things in place and there are certain procedures that are already in place, and showing respect on kind of both sides, and maybe having curiosity about why, or approaching it in a way of, that's such a boomer technology, and just writing it off. I think it's kind of that respect on the other side. It's like, actually show somebody why, we do this, because I think as working parents, we have, a different want and a different need for our own flexibility and space, and it's different, but at the same time, it's we have to be respectful of that, right? But so I think that it's the approach on both sides. It's having that open line of communication and showing people why we communicate a certain way, and just establishing some processes and procedures to vet that, right? And I think that's really, really going to help.
What do you think the processes and procedures might be?
Sure. I think it's allowing permission, right? Permission to bring up new ideas, permission to show that. If companies can establish some things where I think if somebody has an idea, they're able to bring it up in a safe way and they're not written off, they're listened to, even if it's not within a direct manager, but they create opportunities to go share some of these ideas to bring up new things that can actually help the entire organization. And it's not just helping that individual because that's what they need or that's what they prefer. Sometimes we write off those ideas because we're so busy with other things and the processes are in place. But if we don't have a process or a procedure to, rise or bring these ideas up so that everybody can discuss them in a way that's respectful, then I think that, some of these things go unheard. And then you get the frustrations of Gen Z is like, I brought this up multiple times to my manager, but nothing's happened. And I think that, creating that environment from just being that linear path of like, I've got a manager, I brought it up, but they want to be heard. And I'm sure that there's other peers that are within the organization as well that feel very similar to them. So just giving them that opportunity to bring those ideas and seeing them through, I think that is a procedure that a lot of people can implement pretty easily.
These are all ideas that are powerful and actionable, and as Lisa mentioned, don't require massive integrations or adopting arcane technology to achieve. And these are solutions that we need to adopt. I want to thank you, Hui, and thank you, Max, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sarah. It's been an amazing conversation. It's passed so quickly, and we've heard amazing insights into Gen Z and our collective perspective that crystallizes in a way that I've not heard gathered elsewhere. We've heard that perceptions are generational and that Gen Z wants to work, that they're open to mentoring, that they're entrepreneurial, which we know is a strength. So why impugn that? We've heard that they need clear expectations. We know that clear expectations are set with great onboarding programs. Lisa, I loved what you said about intergenerational agility. I'm probably going to be using that in conversations. I don't want to pay you a royalty because I'll become, it'll empty my wallet. But the openness to bring out strengths and creating curiosity as a bridge, like you said, Max, and what you were talking about just now with purpose, with mutual respect, actually, and the permission to bring up ideas. This is a mandate for any organization that wants to innovate. You have to create a safe environment to bring up ideas. And, I think back to your point, Max, curiosity is always a response rather than a reaction, and it can't help but move you forward. From Sarah, we heard amazing stats. 54% of Gen Z prioritizes meaningful work or something that allows them to derive a broader sense of purpose when they're evaluating potential employers. But it's tied very closely to meaning, right? On their priority list is also well-being, like Sarah said, key components. And that employers who are offering exemplary paid off rate 16 times higher in personal relationship satisfaction scores than their peers, and that this winds up saving companies about $12.32 per worker per week. So it makes dollars and cents sense. And for those offering remote work, which comes up a lot in conversations on Job Ready, employees had 2 times better health outcomes, doubled their personal relationship satisfaction scores. And I think the one that really impressed me, and I saw everybody's eyes open a little bit wider, research shows that small businesses who offer flexibility have employees rating the workplace at 125 times more supportive than those that don't offer flexibility. So, the integration of Gen Z into the workforce is going to become a competitive advantage to employers rather than a burden. And we need to see it that way. And so I encourage our audience to take some of these best practices and keep them in mind. And, it's not rocket science. It is basic blocking and tackling for managing humans. And we heard it here today from preeminent experts. You've got to audit your current hiring and management practices for generational bias. You have to implement Gen Z-focused initiatives of some sort. I challenge you to do it within the next quarter. You've got to foster cross-generational mentoring programs. And why wouldn't you? And then finally, measuring and tracking Gen Z employee engagement differently is going to be powerful for you. So as much as I would love to pour coffee and geek out with our speakers, on behalf of our audience, Job Ready Podcast, and our team at EFA, thank you to all our distinguished, groundbreaking, and deeply compassionate speakers, Lisa, Sarah, Max, Hui. It's been my pleasure and honor to work with you all today. And to all of you in our audience, whether you're in HR, talent, higher education, nonprofit, workforce development, or economic development leadership, gratitude and respect for tuning in and caring about how we bridge the generational divide and integrate Gen Z talent into our future workplaces. It's the work not only of a lifetime, but of a generation. Thank you, and be well.